So I'm thrilled to be with you here virtually to celebrate the publication of Rory and Willie's Element and Editing Archipelagic Shakespeare. This is the fourth in the Elements in Shakespeare and Text series, which I co-edit with Rory. And it was a real pleasure to edit this mini graph, which offers a rich account of editorial histories and approaches to naming Scottish, Irish, and Welsh characters in Shakespeare's plays. The Element interrogates received practices of representing such character names in modern editions, and as such, I believe is a must-read for all practicing editors, even if they're not working on plays that feature Welsh, Scottish, or Irish characters, as well as for literary critics interested in the confluence of naming and identity in early modern literature more broadly. So before handing this over to our authors and their esteemed interlocutors, I just want to say a few words about this series. So Rory and I invite you to check out the other published titles in the series, and also to consider whether you have work in progress that might fit the series remit. So we welcome and publish original scholarship about the creation, circulation, reception, remaking, use, performance, teaching, and translation of the Shakespearean text across time and place. So from investigations of the early manuscript and print transmission of Shakespeare's writings to studies about how they have been disseminated globally, this series defines the area of Shakespeare and text, and indeed the concepts of Shakespeare and text broadly, and aims to publish research that challenges and pushes beyond the conventional parameters of textual studies. So as I said, we have 4 published titles in the series. There are 2 more that are slated for publication in the next couple of months. And then we have more than a dozen others at various stages of preparation and production. And these are from scholars working in different national and regional contexts, scholars working on the Shakespearean text in different time periods, and also from scholars who are at various different career stages. And that's very important to us as editors of the series. So please reach out to us if you'd like to discuss an idea. Rory and I will both be at the SAA RSA Extravaganza in March and would welcome the chance to chat then. So thank you again for your support of the series in the form of your presence today. And we definitely will not be upset if you would like to purchase a copy of the book. So, okay. I'll now hand it back to those of you in the room. Thanks again for coming, and thanks for letting me beam into the bookshop today.
Thank you, Claire.
Well, I brought the camera if I stand. Can I stand? Or?
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to say, so last week I was on a pack train in Glasgow going to a football match, and I told my sister I was going to Cambridge. She asked why. My family don't take an interest in the academic side of my life at all. And I told her I was going to Cambridge for a book launch. She asked the title of the book. The carriage was very busy, so I had to enunciate the title clearly as a title that not everyone can grasp. And she laughed loudly, and so did several other people in the carriage. There's business, it was none. So she wouldn't be laughing now, of course, because this could be a bestseller. When I was at Glasgow years ago teaching, I had the pleasure of having Duncan Wu as a colleague. And one day Duncan talked about his romanticism anthology and said it had sold 13,000 copies. And then he said, "How many copies have you sold of the Spencer chronology?" And I said 43. He said 1,000. I said no, 43. So it's hard to do an academic bestseller, but this could be the one. So I'm going to now make a short statement. So I know it's bad form to read, but I'm going to read and then hopefully make a little bit of eye contact. So this little book has deep roots, and those roots go back to February 2016. Rory and I had an exchange of emails about MacMurris, Shakespeare's Irish captain in Henry V. And then Rory sent me, after a few of these emails, a message that said, "Between my editorial side and what you've produced, there is already the bones of an article here. Would you be interested in co-authoring it?" And I said yes, because I'm a great believer in co-authorship, because I'd worked with Rory before and lived to tell the tale on Celtic Shakespeare, and because I felt that our complementary skill sets in textual editing and contextual scholarship made us a good team for the kind of study we wanted to undertake. I mean, I think interdisciplinary research is not me doing history, it's me working with a historian. And co-authorship is only worth doing, not because you want a guilty conscience or somebody to help you out, but because you can bring completely different things to the table as we did. So we had a shared interest in a way in which editorial tradition and critical approaches tended to occlude or oversimplify Shakespeare's naming practices, especially with regard to non-English characters, which was our main focus. And so began the 9-year saga that brought us here this evening. But that saga goes back further still, because in 2011, John Kerrigan and I had discussed McMorris while he was working on an essay on oaths in Henry V. And during that earlier exchange, John, I'm sure tongue-in-cheek, had suggested that Shakespeare Quarterly should devote a special issue to McMorris. And Rory and I did start out with the target journal of Shakespeare Quarterly, as for this article that we were going to write on McMorris. And in the end, it's expanded into 4 captains. Then we also devoted some time to the English officer in the 4 captains scene, Captain Gower, usually excluded from discussions. Englishness doesn't get enough attention. Very sad. We recalled, as we say in our introduction here, that John, to this book, editing Archipelagic Shakespeare, that in 2013, John Kerrigan had suggested that our volume on Celtic Shakespeare could be better termed Archipelagic Shakespeare, and we agreed, hence editing Archipelagic Shakespeare, a title that trips off the tongue and fly off the shelf. Rory and I have both been hugely influenced, of course, by John's magisterial work, Archipelagic English, and more recently by Lorna Hutson's marvellous book on the Elizabethan erasure of Scotland. And we're delighted that John and Lorna could join us for this event. Their work directs our attention to gaps and silences in our understanding of the early modern period arising from an Anglo-centric perspective, something which an archipelagic approach sets out to correct. Paradoxically, that Anglo-centric tradition has also obscured English national identity in all its regional richness. The power of naming is also the power of erasing. Someone once said, try drawing a map of England as opposed to a map of Britain or Scotland. And our book is a modest contribution to the restoration of some names and histories that have been muted over the years by layers of editorial practice and critical commentary. Neither an essay nor a monograph. Editing Archipelagic Shakespeare was a long time in the making, much longer than either of us envisaged. I've now retired, partly due to this. But I'm really glad that we persisted, and we're here to see how the bones of an article have been fleshed out. Thank you.
So I've less prepared marks, but there's a few points I kind of wanted to cover. First of all, it was so wonderful working with Willie. I met him for the first time in 2009 as a PhD student. He came over to Trinity College Dublin, where myself and Crawford Gribben were organising a conference about Scotland, Ireland, Wales and Shakespeare, and Willie gave the plenary. And then that evening, after I think I'd had a glass or 2 of wine and felt bold enough, I asked Willie maybe there'd be a collection of essays that could come out from this, and he kindly said he'd love to co-edit with me. Which is an incredibly generous thing to do for someone at my career stage at that time. And Willie was already a professor over in Glasgow. And I learned so much through that experience of working with him about practice and principles of collaboration. Professional things like how to invite someone to contribute to a collection of essays, how to provide feedback that's incisive without being corrective or without being insulting. And so it was amazing. And we stayed in touch after Celtic Shakespeare, emailing back and forth. I was based in America. I was working in Indianapolis. I was in a basement of a former brothel in Indianapolis where Oxford University Press had set up the office to edit the new Oxford Shakespeare. So I was in this basement. There was 4 or 5 of us editing the works together. And we were divvying up basically the 43 plays from the Shakespeare canon of who was going to edit what. So the negotiations were ongoing through the first year as everyone wanted to edit Titus Andronicus, but what happened was five of us shared the editing. We each got an act, basically, to edit it. But when it came to Henry V, it was a particularly sensitive one to who was going to edit it, because the person in the office next to me was Gary Taylor, who had produced a landmark edition of Henry V back in 1981. And I think I was given Henry V because it has Shakespeare's only Irish character. So they gave me this responsibility. But when I took on that responsibility, I was like, oh gosh, I better do it right. Do right by Mac Morris. And I felt this kind of overwhelming pressure to do it right. There was a character in Henry V called Fluellen. It's the most kind of famous Welsh character. And Andrew Gurr, who had previously edited Henry V, changed the name from Fluellen to Cluellen, with the double L fricative. And as we say in the book, the reaction to it was quite tepid among the editorial community. And one of the reasons why was that he changed Fluellen's name, but then didn't change the names of any of the other characters. So we started exploring these ideas of if you had enough time and dedicated time and space to actually look at each of the characters' names, how productive or how generative could that be? So I made my set of decisions anyway for Henry V, but then I had all this additional material which isn't going to find a place in a textual introduction. And Willie and I started having these conversations about how we could develop this in a really kind of full-blooded way. I don't think the naming of any set of characters in Shakespeare's works or works of other early modern dramas will get 9 years of attention again. But what's so exciting, I think, about this little book is that we gave ourselves the time and the space to really dive as deeply as we could with 4 character names. And only a series like this, so brilliantly edited by Claire and overseen by Emily, could give you that sort of dedicated space to actually produce that sort of work. So it's been an unbelievable honour and pleasure to work with Willie, an absolute legend in the field and an extraordinary collaborator. And I think it's found a wonderful home in this series. So thanks, everyone.
Well, I'm not surprised it took you 9 years to produce. It's beautifully condensed, lucidly argued, full of implications for Shakespeare in general. And it's a major contribution, small though it seems. You've got 3 complex words in the title: editing, archipelagic, and Shakespeare. I'm sure Lorna and I will touch on each of those. I thought I should start with archipelagic, since according to Willie I foisted the word on you. I mean, I think it has a lot to recommend it, but one might also have a few reservations about the word and the methodology that comes with it. For those of you who don't know, obviously archipelago means a group of islands in the sea, but it's been used over the last several decades to describe as neutrally as possible the British-Irish geographical configuration and the interactive events and identities that went around it in the early modern period. The word archipelago was current. It's borrowed into English from Italian in the 16th century, but archipelagic doesn't crop up until the 19th century. No one in the early modern period would have called themselves archipelagic. Very few would have called themselves British either. And Irish is also a term of contention. So none of this is straightforward, but archipelagic does have a slightly external and academic feel that comes along with it being dispassionate. And I wonder whether this lack of embeddedness counts somewhat against the word, whether you felt that it was a useful tool but kind of began to break down or let you down at certain points.
We mentioned that the 3 words of the title are problematic. When I posted about the book on Facebook, my wife wrote under me, "Hold me back." She had an issue with editing and archipelagic and Shakespeare. But archipelagic, yeah, it's not a word we use often in the street. But it's a word that came along to try to solve a problem, and that problem was the British problem. Because in the 1970s, J.G.A. Pocock started talking about a plea for British studies, and then there was all this work on the British problem. Conrad Russell and others, having exhausted themselves talking about the English Civil War and the English Revolution, realised it was a war of the 3 kinds. It was much bigger. But how do you talk about it in a nutshell? It was very hard to find it. And archipelagic was a soothing word that came along that placated the Irish historians like Nicholas Carney, who were Brito-sceptics. They didn't want anything to do with Britain or British as a label just to be slapped on top of these islands, as it were, or England, Scotland. So it was, you either said England, Scotland, Ireland, or I used to say Wales, Ireland, Scotland and England. WISE was my acronym. But so archipelagic came along as a supposedly neutral geographical term to be as inclusive as possible in talking about something which was very problematic and complex, including the issue of Cornwall in the 1640s and so on, or Kent, so or York or the North and so on. So I think there's more attention to that now, but the British wasn't doing it for people, and the British problem. So it's a compromised term. Somebody tried to think of a synonym today, and they said decentered, and I said that won't set the head of the light either. So it's a compromise word, if you like. It's a word that we have to live with if we want to make sure that we're not alienating or insulting our Irish, Scottish and Welsh colleagues, and also to find a way of not subsuming our English national identities under this, word British. So I think in that sense, I think it's a kind of courtesy term in some ways, but you're right that it's not necessarily something which is likely to feature in the Daily Mail.
Well, I'd like to follow on from that. I mean, I think that's a really eloquent defence of archipelagic, and I think there are other problems with British, which I'd like to come on to in a minute. I mean, that anachronistic problems of anachronism and of the change of the meaning of the term British. I thought this was a wonderful book. The way you move from Nicholas Rowe's introducing regularization and the problems of editors simply have to make a choice. Are you going to be consistent, or are you going to, and if you are you going to choose the most used name? I mean, it was very, very interesting the way you unpicked that. And then moving into these chapters where, in looking at the instances of the name, you really uncovered this extraordinary hinterland of presence of, I mean, Morris was particularly interesting because of it being an Anglo-Norman Gallicized patronym. I mean, that was really fascinating. But Jamie as well, because obviously there are lots of King Jameses, but Jamie, is Jamie the diminutive? Is it a deprecating term? Is it an insulting term? And it did seem, from what you were saying, looking particularly at Skelton talking about James IV after Flodden, and Patton talking about James V, that it was used in this very scathing way, so that Captain Jamie could have that. And there were all these extraordinarily rich, and of course, Llewellyn as well, who was defeated by Edward I. And there's of course a play about that too. So that was absolutely marvelous. Then I began to wonder, I mean, obviously your book hasn't got this scope, but the question of that scene, if you're looking at all the, if you're looking at the names, you're sort of regarding them all as comparable figures, or sort of in parallel. I don't think this has to do with archipelagic. And yet it seems to me that there's something very incommensurate about the representation of these figures, and that it's really important to think about the contentlessness of the scene, and why does it begin with Llewellyn wanting to have a discussion about the disciplines of the wars. And everybody picks up What Is My Nation? But, I mean, the fact is that you do feel very sympathetic to this Irish captain who is in the middle of managing a siege, and he's asked by this pedantic Welshman to talk about, whether this is being conducted according to the true disciplines of the wars. And, I mean, as for Captain Jamie, I mean, he says absolutely nothing and could be removed from the scene without any difficulty at all. And in the Dominic Dromgoole production, he speaks completely unintelligibly, and it's just... supposed to be funny. So, so I suppose I'd like to ask you about that asymmetry, and about the fact that Llewellyn's role in thinking about discipline and ethics and the conduct of war is important throughout the play. And so what's going on there, and why?
Sure. Well, I think I can start off with how it's embedded textually. There is a hierarchy that is made or rendered invisible, basically, by editorial practice, which regularizes or standardizes the names so that all of a sudden you don't see that there is actually a hierarchy within the characters established by the text, but then because of editorial practice, that's neutered basically for the reader. So for those not familiar or haven't read the little book, the one of the interesting things about the scene is that the character names for the Irish, Welsh and Scottish characters change from personal names to Irish, Scots and Welsh, whereas the English character still retains their first name, their Gower, throughout. But that's rendered invisible in modern editions, which introduced the proper names of MacMorris, Fluellen, and Jamie. So there is within the folio text this sort of asymmetry and hierarchy. But then when editors actually come to to try and apply some sort of principles or practices around editing, that is rendered invisible then to the reader. So I suppose part of our work here is to be trying to put a spotlight back on how those sort of asymmetries are actually present in the text. We're not advocating for unediting, but we're advocating, I guess, for a greater visibility around editorial decision making.
And just briefly, since it is about the discipline of the wars, and that comes up, kill the boys, killing prisoners, and so on.
And
that's
ransom,
an ethical issue. Ransom. That's an ethical issue throughout the 1590s, and of course Essex going to Ireland issues the laws and orders for the conduct of the war in Ireland and so on. So from our modern point of view, where really anything goes, and there doesn't seem to be any laws and orders of war today. I think it's interesting that Fluellen is such a stickler for the fact that you don't kill prisoners, for example. All these things that are kind of rules, and that's what he's interested in, is trying to balance. Even in the heat of a siege, you have to have some kind of understanding of what's allowable. For example, to be digging mines to blow up your enemy. Is that because that's not combat of a kind that might be celebrated in other ways? So I think it's about kinds of combat changes in war, which have gone much ahead of chivalric, notions. So I think it's really about the nature of war, the changing nature of war, and ethics. So I think in that sense, Fluellen has a lot of weight, ballast, if you like, to offer there.
But why do you think a Welsh character has that? I mean, because in some sense, he's a kind of surrogate for Henry, so that it's Henry really who's keeping the discipline, who doesn't want, for example, French villages to be sacked and paxes stolen, and so he wants Bardolph to be punished and killed for this. But it's Fluellen who refuses Pistol, to save Bardolph, and who insists on it. So do you think that I mean, I'm just interested because I think that the Welsh have a particular position of closeness to the Tudor monarchy, and the British history, that is to say, a text written by Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1137, which is an extraordinarily powerful prophetic history, prophesying the return, prophesying a kind of Welsh, saying that the Welsh were the ancient Britons and had the whole of Britain, and that Arthur would recover Britain, conquer the Scots and the Picts, and recover Britain and come back again. And this became, the English kings appropriated this. So it feels to me that Fluellen has this, that there is much care in this Welshman. He has this sort of surrogacy for Henry in some way, but I don't know if you...
I think that's very persuasive. He's not a bombastic Welsh windbag, or the humorous character that he's seen to be. And I think that's another one of the underminings.
Right,
there's mines being dug under the play, and I think that Fluellen is a much more redemptive character, a much more interesting character than a lot of the criticism, which simply sees him through his Welshness and his language, rather than thinking about
I think it's a privilege
his ethical
privileged position. And you once told me, I remember a long time ago, really, you said, I think it's to me something like, there's never just one historical context, and you said just now about Essex and the laws of war, but the laws of war and ransom and all that kind of thing were terribly important in the 100 Years' War as well. And one of the things I was very interested in, and you mentioned that it was very well known that Henry V brought James the First, not James the Sixth and First, but the actual first James, into war with him to fight against, to fight in France. Now, it seems to me that one of the most extraordinary things about having this scene in Shakespeare's play, to make it seem as though all the British, the archipelago, is fighting on the side of the English, is that everybody knows that the Kingdom of Scotland was the ally of France. And Henry IV had taken James as a child, he was about 12, prisoner when he was a kid. And so he was a prisoner of Henry IV. And then Henry V, when the French were recovering their strength, they were recovering it with the help of the Scots, who were a very militarized society by that time. And so Henry V thought, I've got an idea, I've got a Scot. And so he brought him to the siege of Melun, where he fought against his own people. And then Henry insisted that the Scots who were defeated should not be ransomed, noble prisoners like other prisoners of war, but should be hanged for treason against their king. So in Scottish and French histories, they regard this as a sort of war crime because they say that James was not sworn to his subjects. So I just think that's really interesting because it's clear that Shakespeare was very interested in the ethics and conduct of war because that's part of the flavour of the play, and that's part of why it feels such a serious play. Because there are lots of English nationalist plays like Edward III, that play, but they don't feel serious. We wouldn't keep reading them, whereas this one does. So I don't know if Shakespeare saw that episode and thought, well, I won't put that in, or whether he thought, but that's actually quite an interesting thing, this whole thing about the theatre of war and the
and also these, because Richard II knighted the future Henry V in Ireland.
Yes,
so
yes,
that's
you
another
have
one
that
of
in
those
the book.
things.
Yes,
The one thing I would say about the Laws and Orders of War is a very interesting text. The Essex, or the text appear in Essex's name, because one of the Laws and Orders of War is there should be no quarrels in the camp.
Oh, that's great. Llewellyn says, no kibble tattle, no
which
kibble
puts,
tattle. Yes.
which puts, which
Very
just
good.
adds a kind of paddle there. Yeah, that's fascinating.
So Rory, I know you've done a lot of work on collaboration recently, collaboration between dramatists producing plays, and it's a very important topic in this period. Some of the plays that we think of as canonical for Shakespeare, like Timon of Athens and Two Noble Kinsmen and Henry VIII, are collaborations with other writers. I wanted to ask how you two got on as collaborators, how you divvied up the material, and then when it came to editing Archipelagic Shakespeare, did you edit one another's work, and how did that go?
Yes. Well, it's interesting. In kind of post-pandemic society, we were so much more able, I guess, to meet up. When we were editing Celtic Shakespeare before, it was all by email. And now all of a sudden we were, meeting over Zoom or meeting over Teams, which made, even though we were far apart in other ends of the archipelago, I guess, up in Glasgow and me down in Canterbury, we were meeting quite often in terms of that was how it came about. But we haven't actually met in person in many years. In terms of the actual collaboration over the work, as Willie said, this is kind of a highly condensed little book. So we had it somewhere around 50 to 60,000 words in notes or in kind of fully drafted out for parts of it. And we had to condense this down for the series, which is about 30,000 words. And we were trying to think... and I guess there was a lot of negotiation about what gets in and what gets out. Absolutely, and also kind of what are the key points that we actually wanted to make, as the way in which if you read the book, and hopefully it's quite seamless, but if you read the book, the sections on editing, which are the first and the fourth, I took, I suppose, the lead on in terms of thinking about how to put this into practice, and then Willie's really dense work in the second two sections, which is looking at the origins of the four names. But I suppose everything was done in consultation with the other. We were constantly emailing back and forth with, have you seen this? Have you got this article? And Willie has a trove of, if you've ever collaborated with Willie, you'll know he's got a trove of articles dating back to, and he was always suggesting that I look at that or look at this. So I was trying to look at the history of editorial decision making, and then we were trying to bring that into dialogue with what we could glean about these four names. Was that your your impression of it as
If
well?
I'm misremembering, you
Yeah.
can correct me, because I think
Yeah.
one suggestion I made at a certain point was I find it hard to deal with track changes. I was very poor at maths, and if I'm looking at lots of score outs and so on, I just get lots of cognitive impairment. So did at some point I suggest that, provided we agreed with something, we simply corrected that thing, rather than have too much mess on the page. Because
No file papers.
So no file paper. So it was, so I think to a certain extent we did proceed that way. But the wonderful thing about co-authorship is you find a third voice, and obviously you have your areas of expertise. That's important. You go in different directions. But I think we edited each other's sentences because we had to cut it so severely. So it wasn't as if we edited the parts we were, most familiar with. We went in there and did that work of compression and so on, which had some implications. There's a couple of typos that are a result of the editing Archipelagic Shakespeare, because that final compression, I think we really did put the squeeze on it, and we wanted to do the kind of edit which kept the content but cut the form, and that's quite hard to do, because you start then sometimes interfering with syntax and grammar in a way that's not helpful. But I would say that I found very few when I went through it, but it's great to hear.
Just one more, I suppose, point on this, and it's connected to the series, and Claire really helpfully outlined kind of what the series is about. But the books in the series, or the mini-graphs, are meant to be provocations, and we wanted it to be a provocation whereby it isn't just about the four captains, or it isn't just about the Atlantic archipelago. It's about how can you take some of the ideas underlining the work and apply it elsewhere, not just in the Shakespeare canon, but in early modern drama more broadly, and hopefully impact upon editorial work moving forward. We're not expecting everyone to do 9 years on each character name, but that kind of sense that to not be naive about just reproducing a name that has been reproduced for the last 400 years, or 300 years in the editorial tradition, or 400 years since these works were first printed. And it is extraordinary kind of what things become ossified through editorial accretion.
And early English books online is great for that, for going in and seeing how these threads, sometimes unacknowledged, because you couldn't search, there wasn't a search engine in the 17th and 18th century, that people just freely borrowed, from each other's. And these, so something that was new in 1632 or whatever was being recycled without question much later as a kind, and that's, you did very well on those accretions and palimpsestic nature of the editing process, and how it feeds back into the.
A lot of editing is lazy. It's much easier to reproduce what has been done before than to introduce something new. You don't want to be introduce something new just for innovation's sake, but it's much easier to just accept something that has been reproduced for.
Do you think it's lazy or deferential that people feel slightly intimidated by the way?
That's a better word. We don't want to be saying that editors
No.
are lazy and Anglocentric.
Well, I think no, that's true. But I think any new emendation of Shakespeare's works is by its very nature radical, because to introduce something new to the Shakespearean text is essentially to say, okay, over the last 300 years, all of these people before me have been wrong.
But you're moving on to Turner and Marlowe now. Do you feel that you have a freer hand when it comes to renaming names in those places?
Freer hand maybe with Turner, because I doubt anyone will read it. But Marlowe, Marlowe's, there's a bit more pressure. I was saying to you just before we began here that we're having these kind of monthly meetings with the editorial team, and we're thinking about some of the issues arising from the Archipelagic book in terms of the character names. So we're debating, for example, how to spell the name Mephistopheles, which is a major character in Dr. Faustus, and to work through the various character names and see within the editorial tradition of Marlowe, which is much less developed than say for Shakespeare, has there been any discussion of character names in any kind of disciplined way? Not to bring it back to the word discipline, but in any sort of disciplined way, or have they just kind of reproduced without thinking through the implications of certain names? So Turner less challenging, probably more interesting in the way in which he constructs names. His main antagonist in his main play, which is the atheist tragedy, is called Damnville, which is like it's a portmanteau basically of being damned and a villain. So he just draws together Damnville into a fake French name. But that's interesting. At least you can discuss the character name in a way that sometimes character names aren't discussed.
without being pedantic, though I do love to be pedantic, there is an interesting problem around Danville, because it's D apostrophe small Anvil in the early editions, which has become in later editorial practice D apostrophe capital A. They Frenchify the French name.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that going on in your book. I mean, to go back to the archipelago, I think one thing you brought out was that France was part of the British archipelago in the Middle Ages, and again for Shakespeare's audience. So the French questions, I think, are very
Yes,
salient,
yes.
and they've got lots of implications for elsewhere in Shakespeare. For plays like Love's Labour's Lost, for example, which interfaces with French history in the way Henry V does, but makes even more of a fairy story out of it.
Well, I'll just add quickly, maybe you want to come in on this point. One thing that I think is quite interesting is to think about the regional market Shakespeare and others are writing for, and the pronunciation of certain names. They're hoping to get their actors to be able to say these names in a way that is intelligible to the listeners who are off stage. So essentially in creating these names, they're standardizing their names. Shakespeare is his own first editor. So we point out, why is Hamlet Hamlet? Well, Hamlet is Hamlet because Shakespeare chooses to name Hamlet rather than Amleth. And Hamlet's an easier pronunciation for an actor to say on the stage, and it's an easier thing for someone to listen to in the audience. So why make it more challenging for the actors in the company you're writing for in terms of introducing names? So Montjoie is Mountjoy in Henry V. Is this a conscious choice to anglicize the French form, or is the form that we find in the text actually pronounced on stage in a consciously French way, but we just don't know this? So is the text preserving something that's not actually present in performance?